I'm Simon Colvin. I'm a partner at Pinsent Masons in our technology, media and telecoms group, where I specialise in advising on tech matters, including digitalisation and regulation. We're delighted to be here to talk to you today about data access and sharing and thinking about innovation and how we unlock innovation and growth, thinking about the regulatory regimes that have a bearing on that too. And of course, data is at the heart of everything. For governments and like businesses, they recognise that access to and use of data is imperative for growing our economies. And it's at the foundation of AI, of course, too. The EU 2020 data strategy ambitions for its data economy are somewhat behind target. They aimed to be at 820 billion euros by 2025. But as we'll hear a little bit later on, we are significantly behind the target on that. But the EU has recently launched its digital package on simplification. And that's a simplification of its rulebook, and it recognises the complexity, the fragmentation, and the cost for businesses that exists currently today. And its data-related regulations are right at the heart of all of that. The EU and the UK have overlapping and somewhat different regulatory regimes and non-regulatory guidance in terms of the steps to both access to, sharing and exploitation of data. So today we'll look at the EU and the UK's respective data and digital policies. And given both have similar objectives around innovation and growth, we will consider whether we're seeing these growth objectives for businesses and our economies being achieved, or whether regulation is really causing undue, excessive red tape. And if so, how do we unlock the true value of data whilst navigating those complex legislative and policy requirements? And to bring to life some of these challenges and opportunities, we're going to be focusing in on the automotive, the manufacturing and the health sectors. So with that, I'll now hand over to Sarah Cameron to talk to us about the UK and EU policy perspectives.
Thank you, Simon, for that introduction. So let's just unpack a bit more on the state of the data economy before looking at the respective regulatory landscapes. So this slide shows the figure that you referred to, Simon, the target for 2025 in terms of Europe's data economy, 829 billion, as you say, but in reality, currently only at 630 billion, and another 5 years thought to be required to reach their target. There are a number of factors, of course, that impact the data economy, the economy in the broadest sense, but also digital transformation in business and public services. So this 2025 report on the state of the digital decade gives us a snapshot on both of those aspects. In terms of business, you can see at the top, there's a long way to go in the next 5 years to reach the take up on analytics, data analytics, and also AI adoption. Significantly behind target, a long way to go here, a little bit behind the UK, and both of them a long way behind the US on adoption of AI. A slightly rosier picture in Europe on digital public services, as you can see. They're well into their 80% of their way to 100% access to public services for citizens and for business. So let's just compare that to where the UK sits. So just going back to the data economy values, at the top here, that target we've mentioned, 630 for where we're at now. And this shows you the position if you add the UK's data economy. So around 30% of a boost there. So the UK has a significant economy of its own. And here are the figures for 2020-30, again, with that significant uplift. just looking at this from a global context, and this chart is from the OECD, released this year, looking at how mature are governments across the globe, not just EU and UK. Way out in front is Korea, and leading the pack for Europe is Denmark. Various others like France and Ireland in the top half, above the OECD average. And I think somewhat surprisingly, the UK, obviously on its own, comes in third place. So that gives you a little bit of a snapshot. So let's turn to regulation now at the EU first. This is a diagram from the Interoperable Europe portal, and I've arrowed on this page the public sector related provisions, or some of the key ones. So in terms of opening up access to public sector data and improving intergovernmental sharing, there's the Open Data Directive, which replaced the Reuse of Public Sector Info Directive. And that's about increased access and reuse, a more open by default approach. Then we have the Free Flow of Non-Personal Data Regulation, designed to restrict and limit member states from data localization laws. And then some parts of the Data Governance Act are Chapter 2 to enable the sharing of protected data, introducing safeguards and requirements to make it easier to share data that requires technical safeguards because of privacy or confidentiality. Not on this diagram, but important, is the Interoperable Europe Act itself. That's about interoperability and cooperation in the public sector across member states. So it introduces a mandatory interoperability impact assessment by public sector organisations procuring new IT systems. If we switch on to the private sector, perhaps the flagship regulation here is the Data Act, which Stephan will focus on in more detail, and the Data Governance Act, introducing a regulatory regime for neutral data intermediaries to facilitate trusted data sharing. Just in terms of the Data Act, though, recently applicable from last month, this is about increasing use and fair access to the value of the industrial data generated in Europe, 80% of which apparently is currently unused, and which could add around 270 billion euros worth of value to the EU data economy. So what it does is introduce rights for users of connected products and related services to access and use the data generated, share it with third parties, and increase competition in aftermarket services. More, as I say, from Stephan on that. Not on this slide is another key plank of the EU data economy agenda, which is the Common Data Spaces programme. So it's about ensuring data becomes available for use across public, private sectors by introducing common frameworks for trustworthy and secure exchange, but allowing those contributing and sharing data to remain in control of that. And perhaps the key one of note is the health data space, which Cerys will talk to later as well. So quickly switching to the UK, we have provisions also too, of course, on reuse of public sector information. We're still using the provision inherited from Europe, added to which we have the Digital Economy Act 2017. So this allows or provides for gateways, allowing for very, very tightly defined data sets to be shared across the public sector for tightly defined objectives and purposes. Earlier this year, we have the data sharing framework, much more about governance, principles and actions culturally rather than technically to reduce frictions for sharing across government. We don't have an interoperable Europe Act, perhaps sadly. We rely on the Tech Code of Practice and Model Services Agreement to try and promote interoperability when procuring IT services in the public sector. And just finally, switching to the private sector. So unlike the Data Act in Europe, which is based on connected devices and horizontal, recently on our statute books in the UK is the Data Use and Access Act, which is seeking to extend the open banking regime, which has been a great success, by providing a framework for secondary legislation to introduce smart data schemes in specific verticals. And the roadmap is coming out in the autumn, but we expect that will be energy, transport, real estate, and the digital markets. So that gives you a sort of idea around where the UK sits compared to the EU. And then there's a slide here with just some of the current policy initiatives, a national data library to open up public sector data sets, and some of the other provisions I've mentioned, and I'll leave the rest in the interest of time. So on that note, I'm going to hand to Stephan to bring this to life a bit from the Europe perspective with focus on the Data Act.
Thank you very much, Sarah. This is Stephan Appt. I'm based in Munich, in our Munich office, and lead the German TMT team. I look after automotive clients, manufacturing clients, wider technology space clients. So that is very much the area in which our topic, the Data Act, has come to be very relevant. Now, why is it generating so much attention or so little attention? It has probably been a little bit in the shadows of the AI topic that has consumed a lot of airtime. But now the Data Act has been very much on people's agendas because it went into force or became applicable in September 12th, so just a couple of weeks ago. Now, Sarah has already alluded to the huge number of volumes of data and the potential economic value of that data that is not used so far. So that is exactly what the EU Commission thought when they drafted this law. They wanted to open up data silos and push innovation and competition. And that was done by giving the users of connected products and related services more control over the data that they generate when they use those products and services. So that is, in a nutshell, what the ambition is that the EU Commission has tried to address with this act. Now, what does it apply to? As I said, connected products and related services. That could be in the automotive space, the car, obviously, but also charging infrastructure. That could be in your home, the thermostats or the like, the autonomous lawnmowers in your garden, or the robots in the shop floors, maybe more relevant for data that they generate and that can be used for maintenance purposes, for example. So that is applicable across sectors, and it does cover a wide range of data, not every data that is generated, but raw, pre-processed, and metadata. It also does not differentiate between personal or non-personal data. So both categories will be in the mix and need to be watched out for and dealt with. Now, does the Act only apply to businesses in the EU? No, it doesn't. And that's why we also bring it, that topic on the table today, because we want to also help those colleagues outside of Europe to understand what this Data Act means for their clients. It does have extraterritorial reach. So that is something that you know from GDPR potentially. So if businesses place connected products or provide related services on the European market, this act applies regardless where the manufacturer or the provider of the service or the data holder in that sense is situated outside the EU. So if there is a US or UK company that sells those cars or those thermostats on the European market or provides an app to engage with those products, then that will be, the Data Act will be applicable. Now, what are we talking about? What are the obligations under the Act? I think it's worth mentioning to the fact that there is two main chapters, I would say, that are interesting for your clients. One is chapter 6, which we are not talking about today. It's about cloud switching. It is meant to facilitate the switching from one cloud service to the other, from one data processing service to another. Think about software as a service, infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, these kind of things. Avoiding vendor lock-in means there should be an easy switching process. That means technologically easy, but also contractually easy. So that is something that those providers of those services need to address and work on. But today, let's look at Chapter 2, data sharing obligations, mandatory data sharing obligations for businesses that are data holders primarily. So that is basically a compliance exercise for the most part at the moment, but it's also obviously meant to be an opportunity game because we also want to open the data silos obviously and generate that innovation and competition, and that is obviously the ambition of this Data Act in that sense. Now, the Data Act on one page, this is it. You will see the key players in this environment, the data holder, a user, a data recipient or third party, the manufacturer, and obviously the connected product and related service on the left upper hand corner. Now, the users are the key players because they get to decide who can use the data that those products or services generate. They even can decide whether the data holder actually can use the data for its own purposes, and that would need to be covered by an agreement. They also can say, okay, I want this third party, let's say an insurance in a pay-as-you-drive scenario in the automotive arena. That insurance should get all the data from that in-scope data from the vehicles so that they can offer this better premium based on a data analysis about my driving behavior. So the data holder, the manufacturers, often the OEMs, would need to provide the data to third parties. You can see that from the key here on the left bottom and corner, that there's so much in it. There's agreements, the solid lines, there's data flows to analyze, there's design requirements even for products and services for direct access, and the actual access rights that can be exercised. So a whole lot of things to consider from a legal perspective. And that's outlined here a little bit more. The manufacturers are called upon to decide whether they provide access by design. Actually, the frequently asked questions document from the Commission does emphasize there is a discretion for the manufacturers to do access by design or not. That was not so clear when the Act was first published because the literal language sounds a little bit different. But anyway, access by design and by choice, potentially even it is. Data holders will need to share the data irrespective of whether it's a business to consumer or B2B environment that we're talking about. So that data will need to be shared with users or third parties. If the third parties, they would need to watch out for their contracts to be fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory in the terms that they come up with. Another big topic we touch on later is trade secrets. You can not counter that data access request by way of saying, well, that's trade secret protected, I'm not sharing. That is not possible. You have to share, even though under NDA or other measures. And GDPR, personal data, non-personal data, maybe in the mix, and may cause friction that we also will talk about in a minute. Again, data holders, if they want to use the data that they collect from products and services, they now need a agreement with users and with all of them potentially if there is multiple user scenarios. So that is not necessarily a straightforward task if you don't have a channel of communication with all of the potential users that are in the mix. Another side note, just simply to stress that there is certain rules on B2B agreements for access and use of data, and that is actually not only applicable in the Data Act data in the sharing and access regime sense, but in the wider sense. So it applies for all data transactions, all the contracts about data transactions need to comply with those, basically an unfair contractual terms test that those rules require. We're not looking at B2G data sharing today. That's a bit of a side note, but it is also addressed in the Act. Now, what do businesses need to comply with, or what do they need to do? Now, it's a lot about, as I said, contracts, preparing your contracts that you want to use when you share the data with users or third parties. You need to do your data mapping and understand your data, whether it's personal or non-personal data. Do your data governance and establish those processes that will guide you when those data access requests come in. Because you will need to provide that data easily and in a secure and free of charge to the user in a comprehensive and machine readable format. So all of that obviously needs to be organized in advance so that you can share without undue delay as required by the Act. If you don't comply, or if your clients don't comply with those requirements, the usual sanctions regime or the consequences that you often see will obviously apply. There's fines, there's potentially damage claims, there is unenforceability of your terms if they're unfair. Actions of competitors based on unfair competition law potentially in the mix, and obviously reputational risks also not to forget. Who's on the hook? The manufacturers, in the sense that they have to provide certain information about the data that is generated, which volume, which type, where to access it, whether to use for your own purposes as a provider of a related service. Also, for example, these kind of things, similar like privacy policies almost under GDPR, but obviously different. That is a manufacturer's task. If the manufacturer is also a data holder, they would obviously need to comply with the data sharing requirements. And again, direct access, if that is the way to share the data, that needs to be in place by September 12th in 2026. So that is also something that manufacturers need to think of. Providers of related services face a similar tasks, so that is quite the same. Then we have the data holders. Again, that could be the manufacturer, but doesn't have to be. Can also be another party that holds and controls the data. They have to share the data with the users and designated third parties. Again, they cannot use the data without an agreement with the users. And friend principles are important to apply. The users are not on the hook, so to say, obviously, but they are the ones that are entitled to access the rights. They can authorize third parties, as I said in the example with the insurance, in the pay-as-you-drive example, to receive that data from the data holders. And the third parties obviously would be the ones that receive the data, but they cannot use that data to develop competing products, for example. That's what the Data Act does not allow. But it does allow to develop services that may be a competitive competition to the existing services of those data holders or manufacturers. So that is the innovation that is wanted. There may need to be a reimbursement of a fee to be paid to data holders for making the data available. And there will be most likely some terms that uphold and maintain trade secret protection if there is trade secrets that are going to be shared. How does that all work with GDPR? As I said, it's almost a bit like two trains are on a collision course. The Data Act says share the data, share it, share it, share it. GDPR obviously says you cannot process it or share it without a legal ground. So that is in a friction zone in itself, especially if you have mixed data sets, if you have the viral effect, so to say, of personally identifiable data that can be somehow linked and attributed to a natural person. You need to know your data and do your data mapping and understand which data is personal data, which is not personal data. Otherwise, you will be in a very bad position between a rock and a hard place. Data mapping is really key in the Data Act game. Trade secrets, I already said it. You cannot use that as an argument per se to refuse data sharing unless there is this exemption that if sharing that data will almost, so to say, ruin your business, then you will be able to refuse or suspend data to be shared. But you have to make a case and demonstrate this to the competent authority. So it's quite high thresholds. And the typical scenario would be that you need to find a way to protect and maintain trade secret protection by way of NDAs and other measures that are feasible in that sense. If there is no agreement on those measures, then you can suspend or withhold the data. So you are obviously, you have to be comfortable that trade secret protection can be maintained. What is the state of play with implementation? It has come into effect in September 12th. This year, there will be another milestone 1 year later when data access by design applies, the direct access requirement, or not requirement as you want. It's more a discretionary thing according to the EU Commission. And those unfair contractual terms regimes apply even 1 year later in 2027. Now, the Data Act is a regulation. So as you all probably know, this does not have to be implemented into local member state law. It applies directly, but that's not true for everything. So we have a sanctions regime and appointing the National Data Protection Authority. That is something that is subject to local member state laws, and those laws have not been put in place by now. So member states are late with this. We only have draft laws for most part of the member states, and therefore we don't really finally know what the sanctions will be. In Germany, there's talk about in the draft about 500,000 euros as a maximum. There's other countries like France and the Netherlands that go more for a certain percentage of the annual global turnover. That reminds you of the sanctions regime in GDPR, 4% or so, or maybe 10%. So that can be actually much higher than what we will probably see in Germany. So a patchy landscape there. The data protection authority is also still to be appointed in most jurisdictions. And obviously that is also not very helpful that we are so late with this, but it is what it is. Now, moving on to the next slide. What do businesses need to do? In the first step, really conducting a data survey, doing your mapping, legal review of that, and then obviously generating a compliance report and action plan to do all those things that I just outlined before. Again, there's two focus areas, the compliance focus that has kept our clients busy now for many months. But again, the opportunity is the next stop, of course, to really look at what data can be used for which purpose, that, from data sources that have not been available so far, and that you can now tap into based on the Data Act. And that is the last slide for me, just a little look into an automotive use case. If you are advising an automobile manufacturer, you will have a whole host of activities that are listed here. It obviously starts with identifying the products and services that are in scope, the data mapping that I spoke about. Consider whether you want to address the data access by design rule or not, using or implementing, making sure that you have a data license and agreement with the users so that you can continue using the data that you collect from those products and services. Maybe setting up a framework agreement for those insurance scenarios, for example, where you expect thousands of data access requests. So you would probably set up an a framework agreement, but also an IT infrastructure that really allows you to handle that massive volume of requests. Also discuss with your suppliers how they can help you with complying with the Data Act. If they are processing data for you, then obviously you need their help. So there's many things to look at, and similar things from an opportunity perspective. If you are a provider of repair and maintenance services for robots on a shop floor in a manufacturing environment, for example, you would obviously also do your data mapping and check what data is available now that you had not access to so far, but is important for your data-driven innovation. And then basically gather those users that would be willing to collaborate with you and require the data holder to make the data available to you so that you can provide that innovative service. That, in a nutshell, is the Data Act. So I hand over to Cerys now.
Thank you very much, Stephan. So I'm Cerys Wynn Davies. I'm a partner here at Pinsent Masons. I'm in the intellectual property and data team. So my focus is very much about the use of intellectual property rights, their protection, and also very much around data privacy, but also the value that can be secured from using data properly. And then looking at it in particular with new emerging technologies, particularly, or has already been mentioned, the use of AI, and that makes data even more valuable, provided, again, we use it properly and we have the right quality data. I also have a focus on the life sciences and healthcare sector, so do a lot of work in that area, particularly focusing on data issues and emerging technologies. So I'm now going to move from the broader data issues in manufacturing, automotive, and into life sciences and healthcare. So we're looking here at healthcare data, which we know is sensitive data. It's typically will be personal data. And we also know it's very valuable. So it can take many forms, but typically today it's electronic health records, genomic information, and medical research data. Highly sensitive, but highly valuable. And really it achieves two things. Perhaps if we say economies first, because that's important to all data, but a bigger value to us all is the value of using data to improve health outcomes. But there are a number of challenges, as has been mentioned by Stephan, around personal data. We need to protect the privacy of that data. We need to secure the data. And therefore, there are necessarily access and sharing challenges when we look to health data. So what's happening around this space? Well, one of the first things to talk about is the European Health Data Space Regulation, and that entered into force this year. So there's a lot been happening in Europe around data this year. And I'm going to talk through what that framework establishes and the direction of travel. And then coming to the UK, quite new to that party, we've had key developments there around the UK Health Data Research Service. So again, we're going to look at some of the parallels that we've got around its use in the UK. So let's have a look at what the regulation actually provides for. So it's the first EU-wide health data framework. The whole purpose of it is this health data sharing and access across the EU. And it's for the purpose of exchanging electronic health data. So that very much has a patient use, and then facilitating a secondary use of data for research and innovation. It also strengthens patients' control and access to their health data. It takes account of all of the interoperability that we need in order to do that. But it also provides great privacy and interoperability standards to ensure that privacy remains in place. Like Stephan was saying around the manufacturing space and automotive, we also have a broad range of stakeholders that need to be considered. So we have the healthcare providers, and we have the EHR system manufacturers themselves, digital health companies, and the researchers, the pharma companies, and those processing health data. So we need to be aware of all of those. So again, a phased implementation. So there's quite a long way to go with this. So we're only at the beginning, but you'll see from that, and the slides will be shared, so you'll be able to follow that, that pathway, that there's a lot to be looked for and a lot to be gained from the pathway that we are following. So let's delve a bit more into the detail. So I talked about the sharing of data for health. So that's the first thing that we focus on. That's the primary use of health data. And really the achievement of being able to access your healthcare anywhere across the EU, because the healthcare professionals will have access to that data. So we have this establishment of a cross-border digital infrastructure that enables that. As you can imagine, that in itself is quite a big task ahead. And then those practitioners will, as well as accessing the records, they'll need to update them. So we have a live look at our data at any point in time. So what about secondary use? So this is perhaps the most exciting area in terms of innovation, because there have been real challenges over researchers, pharma companies, others who are interested in progressing innovation in health through accessing data, actually being able to do so because of the privacy concerns around it. But the idea of this regulation is to establish lawful use by setting up a framework that ensures the proper use and protection. So there will be this Health Data Act EU system and infrastructure that you can connect to access the data. And if we look back to what Stephan was saying earlier about data holders, we also have a requirement that with that framework in place, the EU health data holders need to contribute their data to the data sets, make them available to be put into this secure processing environment. They have to catalogue them. They have to keep it verified and up to date, ensuring transparency and accuracy. So that's quite an ask in itself. Opportunities. I said at the beginning, there are these huge opportunities around the use of health data, and that's why there needs to be this investment, this taking away of friction, and making it easier and quicker for everybody to progress. So the patient's benefit we've talked about, it's the access and ability to manage their health data. But it's also seen that by creating this framework, we'll also be able to provide greater privacy and security around those health records. And then those fantastic opportunities for businesses, research institutes in the various areas of health to access the EU citizens' health data. So across the EU, providing a very large real-world data set to be used to accelerate that development and validation of new drugs. It's going to be available in this secure environment to ensure that privacy, but ensure the value that can be achieved. There are these compliance requirements that we need to think about, and we'll have a look at some of these in a little bit more detail. But you have to respect patients' opt-out preferences, so they don't have to share their data. You have to look at intellectual property, although there are some limits on that, as Stephan mentioned earlier, the same applies here. And then that essential data security. So in terms of compliance obligations, the first are around the technical obligations, which you'll have gathered from what I've been saying, are absolutely critical to enable this to work in a properly secure and safe way. So if we go to the EHR systems, those actually have to satisfy requirements around interoperability, security, safety, and privacy, but they must also undergo certification before they are actually released. There also needs to be a facilitation of data exchange. So again, people who are actually trying to withhold data aren't going to fare well within this environment. And interestingly here, again, looking at the challenges around what needs to be done, healthcare providers need to update their digital infrastructure. So quite a lot to be done there. There are further obligations around your collection of data to make sure that it's structured, facilitating that exchange, making sure for secondary use it's anonymized or pseudonymized, and providing those environments that are secure. So I will leave you to have a look at those requirements within that slide, but perhaps jumping to the risks that of non-compliance. And as Stephan mentioned earlier, reputational risks always fare very highly in any compliance, but particularly when we're talking about health and health data, we know that patients need to trust the environments in order to share their data. So reputation is key. But you'll see here that we have very similar level fines to that with GDPR. So it's certainly one that compliance, because of the matters that are at risk from this, need to be considered carefully. So I've said I'd mentioned intellectual property. So the same in this regime, that we start from a position that trade secrets, you can mention them as being a key issue, that you need to think about that, and you need to inform the authority that you have intellectual property trade secrets within your data sets. However, as Stephan said, in his case, you need to make out your case very well, because ultimately it won't be your decision. It will be the authority's decision as to whether or not they consider it is sufficient to withhold that data from sharing. It is more likely that NDAs may be put in place, but you would need to have a clear case around that. So let's move from the EU and look at what's happening in the UK. As I mentioned at the beginning, the UK is very much following this path. There are close similarities, but we're on perhaps an earlier stage, but I think there are exciting times ahead. So the NHS has, for many years, been held out as a place where a lot of information is held. Treatments for millions of people is held within NHS systems. So that can have a massive impact on people across the whole world. And this has been announced. The Health Data Research Service was announced in April of this year by the Prime Minister to, as was said, turbocharge medical research, part of the government's 10-year health plan. So this is the path that we're on. And the idea, as with the EU position, is to ensure that researchers can access that data in a single secure environment. Pharma companies can access data in a lawful way to enable faster clinical trials, access to drug discovery information, and patients get their personalised medicines developed more quickly. And the NHS can care better with the information available, the best possible evidence to them. So that is the plan. So what's happening? Again, you'll see the similarities with the EU position. These are the capabilities under discussion, but you'll see immediately that they are very important pillars to this framework. So access to comprehensive health records, making sure that all of the linkages are there with primary care, hospitals, etc., whilst protecting patient privacy. That balance is always there. Access to major research studies, again, those being made available to have a complete data set, a complete picture. Diagnostics information, genomic data, again, the mention of integration of those health data within the platforms for accessibility and simplicity. The challenges around accessing this data have been huge. The UK has talked about the importance of access for many years, but this is the first real step to providing a framework to make it available. And then privacy. Again, it has been made very clear that we need public trust. There have been mistakes made in the UK in the past where we haven't brought that patient trust with us, and that is seen as supreme. So every aspect must include privacy by design, cybersecurity by design, secure environments, robust governance. And the HDRS is working with all stakeholders, public, patient groups, privacy experts, in order to make sure that this is done in the right way. And it's worth mentioning here that we also see a development in a separate piece of UK legislation around the Data Use and Access Act that has also come into force this year. And that has provided both clarity and perhaps a more permissive framework around scientific research, which is also hoped to make a difference in this space. So what happens next? Again, what we're expecting is all of these consultations, all of the support from these very key areas, stakeholders, but experts in their field coming together, making sure the public are involved. And then we're hoping to see the first services launched by the end of 2026. So a relatively short timescale there. So I expect a lot will be coming forward in the next 12 months, and look out for that. And with that, I'm going to hand back to Simon.
Great, thanks, Cerys. Really, really interesting to see, and it's great to get an insight into the way in which the regulation is coming forth and some of the main pillars that we can see in terms of the sector approach as well. Sarah, I was just going to come to you briefly. In light of that and the many pieces of legislation that you talked about when you presented earlier, we hear a lot about regulatory regret in the case of the EU, the AI legislation, etc. But we are also seeing the simplification agenda coming forth now. So where do you think we are? Do you think we're still in that phase of regulatory regret, or do you think we've turned a good corner?
I think in the EU, we're at the beginning of their digital simplification omnibus, so that will take a bit of time. But if you think about how long it takes for these regulations to go through the negotiation process and the different institutions, it's hard to imagine there's going to be wholesale change of the regulation that's already on the books, as it were. It's more likely to be tweaks or interpretation, help, or maybe some of the codes and standards being a slightly more simplified approach. The aim, of course, is to cut cost and increase innovation and competition. So the EU is trying to do that, but they're doing a lot of great stuff. Their data spaces have already got 1 million data sets shared. Their Interoperable Europe Act is I think, a very good one. Compared to the UK, we've always had a light touch. People criticise that for lack of certainty. We've got an AI regulation coming shortly. But I think there are pros and cons to each. It'll settle down. There's plenty of space for us to cooperate and try and make it easier for business across Europe and the EU.
Great, thanks, Sarah. And Stephan, if I can come to you, we've touched upon opportunities, and a lot of the legislation we've talked about today really does present some great opportunities for business and a real opportunity to grow the digital economy. In light of your guidance around the Data Act, are you seeing much in the space of that focus on the opportunity, or is all of the focus right now on that pure compliance play?
Yeah, Simon, thanks. I think the predominant topic is the compliance and preparing for it and implementing measures to comply with it. But we obviously at the same time see what they expect and who is expected to take the opportunity. And that would be the example in the automotive industry with insurance companies that want to use the data for their pay-as-you-drive offerings. And that's, again, the reason why even big IT infrastructure is being built, so to handle those requests. So there is the expectation that those kind of players will seize the opportunity, but it is very different from sector to sector, I'm sure. Maybe there's not so much appetite for the data in the connected lawnmower arena potentially. So it really depends. We also know that there is web data crawlers that collect data just for the sake of having it and then looking how to monetize or sell it onwards. So that those guys are also making use of the Data Act. They were probably not the main players that the EU Commission had in mind. But anyway, I mean, it's about innovation. Sometimes innovation takes time. Sometimes it's a chicken and egg thing, and you only need access to the data before you can innovate. So let's see.
There are potentially real opportunities opening up in the future once we've got past that compliance point. Great. And then, Cerys, just before we wrap up, I was keen to come to you. Obviously, with the focus in today's session on health data, the sensitivities of the data owners when we're thinking about health data is absolutely paramount. And I was just interested to hear your view on how well you think the legislative frameworks that are upcoming, both in the UK and in Europe, are going to meet that challenge and secure the trust of data owners so that we really can see the major benefit of these data sharing and research opportunities that you've talked about.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think this is a space where the opportunity is certainly seen as very high because of the nature of that opportunity in particular. But also it is that challenge around privacy. And I think we've seen both within the EU regulation and also what's proposed in the UK that riding through the whole discussion is the privacy aspect. And because it's known that first of all, if you don't get the trust, you won't get the data contributed. But also, if there are any issues with it being used inappropriately, being accessed inappropriately, then the significance, the effect of that is going to be substantial. So I'm expecting to see those technical compliance requirements remaining really important, very stringent. But it's a challenge with technology. So we're always going to have to make sure that those meet standards that avoid cybersecurity issues, for example. And as Stephan mentioned, we also need to be aware of crawlers who may want to use the data for many purposes, but particularly AI purposes. There'll be huge value in using AI, but it also produces a risk as well.
Yeah, very much so. Thanks, Cerys, for those thoughts. So really, that brings us to the end of the session today. It's been really interesting to dip into the comparisons between what's happening in the EU and what's happening in the UK, and obviously for all of us engaged in advising clients, whether our clients are based in the EU or in the UK, due to the extraterritorial effects that we've talked about, we all need to be on top of all of these issues. It is certainly still a minefield of analysis and assessment to look at the different regimes that are coming through in terms of upcoming and current legislation. But there are real opportunities that we can see, and a lot of the health data examples that Cerys talked about, these really are being founded on greater sharing, greater benefit, and the greater benefit to the wider society and the digital economy in better use and better exploitation of this data. I think it remains for us as the legal community to be making sure that we're on top of these upcoming legislative changes and the linkages and the slightly jagged edges sometimes that we're seeing between these different regulatory regimes. It's a great opportunity for our clients, and so really it is a great opportunity for us to help them with their strategies, both for compliance, both for business opportunities, and to help lead them and to be able to embrace that digital economy today and in the future. So hopefully we've left you with some good thoughts to take away in terms of advising your clients. And if you're at the iTech Law Europe event in October, we'd love to see you and we can chat about these issues further. I'll thank Sarah, Cerys and Stephan as well today, and we'll be in touch. Thanks very much.